Hey everybody, KMO here. It is Thursday. I will be watching at least Star Trek Discovery tonight and possibly the Orville, although the Orville I think we'll have to wait until tomorrow morning. But in this video, I am going to share a bit of feedback that I received. First, a little bit of explanation. I have been doing a podcast. It's called the C-Realm Podcast since October of 2006. And for a very long time, a very significant portion of the 12, 13 years that I've been doing this podcast, I have talked to a lot of people, authors and academics and people who are homesteading, and basically lots of people who are motivated by the idea of peak oil and a collapse of industrial civilization that will result from the exhaustion of our supplies of cheap and readily available fossil fuel energy. I have grown distant from that narrative, to say the least, in the last couple of years, and in just the last couple of weeks, it's really sort of been a bee in my bonnet. And I put out a podcast just this week in which I expressed the losing of my peak oil religion to my longtime friend and somebody who is well known for his views on peak oil, James Howard Kunstler. That is C-Realm Podcast episode number 539. I'll post a link to it in the video description. But in response to my recent videos and also to that podcast discussion, I believe, a listener from the Netherlands sent me the following. He writes, "Dear KMO, I have been watching your videos as they come out, and I applaud your efforts. I'd like to take this time to reflect on the collapse narrative, tell you about where I situate that narrative in my and my country's story, and share some observations on technology, the future, and the state of the union. I first learned about peak oil sometime after the 2008 financial crash. Psychologically, that came at the right time for me, because I was filled with disgust with the capitalist system and society more generally. I had been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, and after a period of acceptance and feeling that it reconciled me with some past struggles, I began to see that narrative as limiting, hostile, and oppressive. I also read Foucault back then. Enter peak oil. The system would collapse on its own, and there was nothing I or anybody else would have to do about it. I would like to say that I discovered the C-Realm during a hard time. I was unemployed and had moved back in with my mom at age 26, and that your kind and gentle voice and imprecation to stay well had and has the character of a blessing. The thing is, being Dutch, one grows up living on the seafloor and never really thinking about it. There are houses, though, which are below sea level that were built centuries ago, some of which haven't flooded even once. This country is a beautiful creation of generations of inventive people, caring for their corner of the world, paid for by the exploitation of other corners and other people. Climate change and the resulting sea level rise are an existential threat to this country. Enter peak oil. Climate change is self-limiting because the carbon-based economy is ending soon. Personally, once I had been dug out of the hole I was in, I decided to go back to university and train to be a minister in the Church of the Netherlands. I think the belief in progress, the civil religion of the Western world, is on its last legs, and that a period of retrenchment and reflection is imminent. However, should progress continue, the ministry is probably the last job to be taken over by AI, Douglas Adams' electric monk notwithstanding. Mass technological unemployment would certainly result in new and interesting existential questions and demand for pastoral care. When my wife was offered a postdoctoral position in astronomy in a different city, we moved to a nearby village and started implementing a degree of self-sufficiency. My wife is an avid gardener, and I am an avid cook. She grows the food, and I preserve the harvest, bake bread, brew beer. I hope to move into cheesemaking next. This is a satisfying way of life to me that is also a prefigurative protest against consumer culture. Yet I must admit that we are also well prepared for collapse, should it come. While I haven't stood where you stood in one of last week's videos, he's talking about a video that I shot at the Palisades Park, which overlooks the Hudson River from the New Jersey side of the river, opposite and a little north of New York City. I have visited your country twice, once in 2007 when I hiked the length of the Pacific Crest Trail, and once 10 years later on my honeymoon when we hiked a section of the Continental Divide Trail in Wyoming and watched the solar eclipse. The homelessness, despair, and dilapidation that I saw on the second trip was profoundly shocking. It reminded me a lot of my visits to Eastern Europe. We rode a Greyhound bus from Rock Springs, Wyoming to Denver, Colorado, and the contrast between those places and the people who inhabit them is as stark as to be mind-bending. That brings me to the State of the Union. I am a huge political nerd, and I used to stay up late to watch U.S. politics and smoke weed with my college roommate. This year, I didn't have the time to stay up late, nor the inclination to watch the entire thing later. However, I did catch the bit where President Trump acknowledged Buzz Aldrin. Half a century later, we are joined by one of the Apollo 11 astronauts who planted that flag, Buzz Aldrin. Thank you, Buzz. This year, American astronauts will go back to space on American rockets. As a Trekkie, those words, accompanied by the image of a frail elderly man wearing a star-spangled necktie, left me with a profound sense of nostalgia and loss. On a happier note, I will be subscribing to the C-Realm Vault for as long as you keep up the daily video schedule. If you wish, you may now consider your videos as having made you money. With the warmest of regards, JD. P.S. I was sorry to hear your relationship didn't work out. What else have I missed? Is Mocha the three-legged cat still alive? If so, YouTube demands a cat video. Post P.S. Love the t-shirt collection, but isn't it cold out there? So, thanks, JD. And yeah, it's pretty cold here in Vermont, but it is toasty warm here in my apartment. My apartment, where this is a bit of a moral hazard, I realize. It is all expenses included, including electricity, and I have electric baseboard heating. So I can keep it as warm as I want in my apartment, and it doesn't cost me a dime more than it would if I sat here shivering in the cold. Backing up a little, you say that you don't observe people behaving all that differently now as a result of mobile computing and social media. But if you'll recall, my point was that ubiquitous mobile computing and social media have changed our life in the past decade more than fossil fuel constraints have. Fossil fuel constraints have had, as far as I can see, very little effect on my lifestyle. Far less than, say, the lack of money in my life. And much, much less than social media has had in my relationships with the people that I communicate with. Particularly now that I'm off of Facebook. You know, when I got kicked off of Facebook, I thought that I would probably shift my social media attention more over to Twitter, and I am using Twitter more than I did before I got kicked off Facebook, but not to the point where I'm spending as much time on social media as I did before. I spend far less time with social media now, but I have to say that Twitter and YouTube, when it comes to communicating with people that you don't know in real life, these are two mediums which really seem to encourage and reward rude behavior. Insulting people you've never met, people that you'd probably get along with all right if you were talking to them face to face. I think both platforms, and probably several others that I haven't really bothered to familiarize myself with, they all encourage us to cast the person that we are talking to as the embodiment of an idea that we disagree with. And not as, complicated people with complicated motivations and a personal history, which probably explains why they gravitate to the things they gravitate to. Given what you've told me about your lifestyle, I think that you are preparing for collapse in the most workable fashion that I can imagine. Well done. And I agree that pastoral care is probably one of the last things that will be automated. Certainly, I think that people with money and in need of pastoral care will pay extra, for the human premium, even once there is artificial general intelligence, and basically everybody is carrying around not only a portal to the world in their pocket, but also a psychiatrist who will keep them, I guess I should say a psychologist, not a psychiatrist, as the program most likely will not be licensed to prescribe drugs. But it will still be a little assistant, always in your ear, helping you to reframe things in the most positive fashion possible. Depending on, what sort of AI you're carrying around, you might be carrying around the jihadi AI, which encourages you to see everything in the starkest and most ideological terms of the most regressive forms of Sunni Islam. That could be the little voice in your ear all the time. Wouldn't that be fun? You mentioned the Electric Monk from Douglas Adams, and for people who missed that reference, that's from the novel Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency, and there is an electric monk who has been designed to believe things that humans can't believe. Most humans, anyway. I liked your phrase when you said, talking about all the things that you do, gardening, preserving food, brewing beer, baking bread, moving into cheese making. You wrote, "This is a satisfying way of life to me that is also a prefigurative protest against consumer culture." I like the prefigurative protest against consumer culture. Nice alliteration there. I noticed that wasn't the only alliteration that you used in your letter. And yes, if you ride a Greyhound bus anywhere in the United States, you are likely to see the places that are doing the least well. Basically, the sacrifice zones, as Chris Hedges put it in his recent book, the one with Joe Sacco, Days of Resistance, Days of Rage, I think it was. And as to President Trump's comment about how this year American astronauts will be returning to space on American rockets, it's a bizarre situation that since long before Donald Trump's tenure in the White House, the United States has not had the capacity to put its own astronauts into orbit, and we have been dependent on the Russian Space Agency. Well, I don't know what he means when he says that American astronauts will be going up in American rockets, unless he's talking about like private rockets from SpaceX or something. But to the best of my knowledge, NASA isn't anywhere near being able to put humans in space again. Maybe I'm wrong about that. If I don't know what I'm talking about and you do, please let me know. This is for JD or anybody listening. And as to your question and your postscript, I still have my three-legged black cat, Mocha. She has lived in quite a few places and moved many times with me, but she's right here, right next to me right now. She's about 13, and I expect she'll hang in there for several more years. So, I might do some internet cat video making, but she is a black cat, and black cats are notoriously difficult to photograph. They always tend to be just silhouettes. And the t-shirt collection. You've basically seen them all. So if anybody has any suggestions for new t-shirts with clever designs on them or, clever phrases, let me know. All right. JD, thanks so much for that feedback. And, I say this not just to you, but everybody watching. Stay well.